Hi guys. This isn't so much a tutorial as much as just showing you a visualization workflow for getting some nicer diagrams out of Rhino. So you should have all installed Vray by now and have licenses. So I'll go through a little workflow I have for putting together a diagram that I did for a previous project. I've brought in this file that has some geometry. You see a robot and the sort of fabrication setup. It's pretty highly detailed, has both small little members, some line work, larger objects and surfaces. I'll go to rendered mode, and you can see that these things are not just basic objects, but they have a little more detail. And so the workflow that I'll go through will sort of pull out some information so you can make a convincing diagram without having to render it realistically. So I'll show you what I end up with. So I want to have some differentiation in materials. So I have kind of dark materials, light materials, kind of medium color materials. I have some color called out in terms of sort of the robot path in blue. I have some reflections on the surfaces so that I can see it more spatially. It's not a flat image, but it has some depth to it. And you can see the background sort of left almost ambiguous, sort of a studio setup, if you will. So we have this geometry in here. I'll go through the setup a little bit and what I've done. If you download Vray, you'll see a new tab, or if not, you can include it by showing certain toolbars. You'll probably see different Vray options that you can put in to here and drag up top. I'm not going to use that one. I'll just use the compact one. And so the V at the very beginning has your basic Vray configuration. Close some of these things down. You won't have materials on here, so I'll go through quickly what I did with materials and show how I applied them, and a couple settings that I might have changed from the default. I'll give you a sort of basic template for this. You might want to adjust it to your own sort of projects, but hopefully we can start getting better images out of these projects that we're turning in, instead of having the standard Rhino screenshot or sort of showing the geometry that doesn't look so presentable in the way we're doing it. Okay, so let's quickly start with some sort of material. You can see here that I have the different materials I was talking about. I have dark materials, light materials, medium materials. A few of the other ones, I have the blue material that I was using for the line work. A few other ones that you might not know what they are tune materials that I have for each color, and a wrapper material. I'll go into those a little bit later in a minute. But first, how do you make a material? If you haven't used it before, you can come down here to say add material, and the standard material is just generic. There's you can see this larger list of materials that you can get into. We won't get into them all, but I've basically used only generic materials, a tune material, and a wrapper material. So we'll start with the generic material. You can see that comes up, and if you don't see this part over here, you might see this. There's a little arrow there that gives you more options. Generic material you have comes in, it basically just has a gray color, not much else besides that. You can use your quick settings. Pick, instead of a generic material, you can pick something, you say metal, and it's, gives you something shiny. And those are fine for some operations. I'm not doing a photorealistic rendering, so I just want to sort of tweak them myself. So I came in here, and for this option, I clicked on the diffuse color, and I could say, okay, make a white material, and that color is essentially all I need. There's a few other things depending on the material. I changed them up a little more. The medium material I wanted to use for sort of the metal, like this was a steel frame that was made, so I wanted to give it a little more gloss reflection, as well as some of the other darker materials. So in all cases, I gave it some sort of reflection. So the reflection is sort of determined by this color. When it's black, it's not really reflective. When it's white, it gets more reflection. So I gave it some reflection. And then your reflection glossiness will give it how diffuse that reflection is. I think I turned that down to maybe 0.8. So still reflective, but you get those kind of hazy reflections. You can see, if I go back to the image, you see the hazy sort of reflection of this, or the hazy sort of reflection in the floor. And so those are things that give it a lot more depth. So you can adjust that. If you turn it down too low, it just reads as flat again. If it's too high, it's super shiny. So 0.8 is something that I did for these. That's essentially all I changed on these materials. I believe there's other things such as refraction that you can set, which will determine how transparent it is. It's more like glassy if you turn that refraction color up. But I just made some solids. We'll go into more depth some of these settings and materials in the next couple of class periods. These are just a basic sort of setup they can use. So if I go back to material list, I can right click on that and rename it something. I'm gonna rename it white. Okay, so now I have a white material. Now, something else that I've done is made tune materials for all of these. And if you notice from the image that all of these things kind of have little outlines, and people used to make 2D their models and try to overlay those on top of each other, and in Illustrator, and that just gets a little messy. You can do this all in one step. So if you add another material and you make a tune just takes some base material. I'm going to use the white, and it gives it these outlines around it. And you can have control over this. What is the line color? I can make it red if I wanted to, and you can see that come out a little more. I usually just use black, so it's much more like a drawing as well. You can change the opacity, you can change the line weight, you can make it super thick. That gets a little too cartoony, so I don't typically go that thick. And then you can also give it sort of a multiply silhouette. So just on the edge, it'll make it slightly thicker. So you can pull that down and see that a little bit. These are reading as edges because it's a separate material from there to there, but where it's not an edge, you can see it's little not as thick. You can see that more on the other one. I usually don't turn that one up that much either, but I do use it. I might set it to 2 or something like that. You can adjust those per your preferences. Okay, so then you have this tune material that has a little bit of reflectivity. That's essentially what I've done for this light tune. Same sort of thing. I have the color line width. That one I put at 0.5. Multiplier I have at 1.5, so it's not too different than what I set it before. And then I've made 3 copies of that, one for a dark material. You can see that this has a lot more reflectivity. It's not as blurred as the white is. And the same for the medium, which is kind of almost plasticky looking. Now, the blue material was just a generic one. It's almost flat. I was using it to call out certain diagram information in the drawing. You can make materials like that, but I use them very sparingly to not add too much color, only where needed. I didn't change any of the information about that because I just wanted it to be a plain basic material. The other one that I have is called a wrapper. Now, what the wrapper does is it allows me to map materials to objects that I don't want to see, but I still want to notice that they're there. So if you notice in this rendering, the background's kind of gray. There's like a big white spot in the back. There's reflections down here. I actually don't want the background to show up in my image because I want to say put it on a, if I want to put this on a white sheet of paper, I don't want this gray box to be around this image as if it were a JPEG. So I'm going to save this out with a transparent background, but I still want to see these nice reflections. So I make this a matte material and it shows up like this. But if I go back to this drawing, you can see that it's all white and these reflections still come out. So this material actually didn't get rendered, just the reflection and lighting effects on it did. So it still has a transparent background. In the settings, you'll have a bunch of things like this that you can look at. We won't go into too many of these. I essentially like to use the basic defaults for some of these. I don't add a lot of lights. I'm not using any lights. I do change a couple things. I think the standard is 10 for exposure, so I didn't actually change that. But I will sort of make the lighting exposure, if I think, turn it up or turn it down, and do a couple test renderings to see if I get good lighting. You can change the render output. This is set to kind of medium high, 2000 by 1125. When I'm doing a production rendering, I get upwards of 4,000 sometimes, depending how large I want the image to be. In the environment, I don't think I changed anything there. In global illumination, you can see that your standard is brute force, and that works okay. It sort of, as the name implies, just sort of like crunches the numbers as hard as it can. You can change those to a radiance map and it'll speed up a little bit. Even within that, I'm not really changing the settings too much. I think Vray's done a good job at sort of making things that work well, but if you want to tweak those in the future, you can. And then the only other thing that I turned on was a denoiser. You'll see in the rendering, I'll close this down for right now. You'll see in the rendering that it's pretty clean. This is because I've added this. If you go to what the actual image looks like, you'll see a lot more noise all over that whole image. So the added denoiser cleans that up quite a bit. Okay. And let's see, what else did I add to that? I typically also add an ambient occlusion. So that makes the sort of deep, shadowy areas where, you know, like joints and things are, it makes it a little darker. I guess in this case I didn't really use one, but I usually turn it on and sort of adjust that to the right radius and the occlusion amount to get a little bit more depth in that. So once I have those sort of settings, if I render it, you can see that this starts to render. Now these little buckets that are moving around the screen are pretty small. That means I'm getting a higher resolution image, and it's going to take a few minutes to do this because it's kind of set as a final rendering for the most part. In the render output, you see I've set it pretty large. I have the quality set to medium. It's actually not that high. For final outputs, I would probably go even larger. Obviously, that slows that down, but it's worth it if you're going to use this as a large image. I won't sit here and watch this. I'll actually pause it and come back at the end of. Okay, you can see here the rendering is done. It looks about the same as I had before. The reflections are there. The sort of noise is canceled. So I want to now bring that into Photoshop so I can see what it looks like, because this is kind of a deceiving image. It's not going to be the same thing. This background is going to sort of disappear. So I'm going to save that as something, let's say robot test. Save that. Now I'm going to open up Photoshop, and we'll see what it looks like. So you can see here the background is completely transparent. You can barely tell that there's reflections down here. So I'll go in and add a new layer, drag it to the bottom, and I'll just paint that layer white so you can see how that looks. So now that's pretty good for a diagram. It didn't take me too long. The majority of it is just having a detailed model where that works really well. If that's just a simple box, it'll look fine, but it won't have the sort of intricacy of a nice model to really pull out some information on. So you can use that technique, hopefully for the rest of the assignments, so that these images are more presentable. They're not Rhino screen captures. They don't have like the ISO curve lines of the surface, so you can tell directly by looking at it that it's just coming straight from a Rhino viewport. We want these to be more presentable, and you can show these in some sort of presentation.